in typical fashion, I'm going to just... it's been pointed out that a noisy miner is a key threatening process. And I think I'm just going to roll with this metaphor a bit. So from a government perspective, sometimes I might be a bit of a pest and advocates might be a bit of a pest. But I actually self-identify, and as a proud Canberran, as a gang cockatoo. We're really charismatic, we're loud, we're in your face, but we're also, under threat and pressure. So we just minimise that one. Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to talk a bit about overcoming barriers to conservation, but I'd also like to kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of lands across Australia, in particular where we are now, and also where I live and work, which is Ngunnawal Ngambri country, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded over those lands. So I'm going to kick off with what we all know. Like, biodiversity is declining, and none of these two key charts should be a surprise to anyone in this room. But why am I kicking off with it? Why am I telling you stuff you already know? Is because we need to tell this story more often. We need to tell it to Australians around and the world around what is happening to nature and biodiversity if we want to see action for it to change. And we need to embed in our own narratives that story of decline, because that is actually a really important part. We also know what threatens biodiversity in Australia. We've got these 4 mega drivers. And James talks about the complexity of it, but at a broad level, if we know we're tackling these 4 key drivers, we know we are doing pretty good things. If you need me to explain it, it's obviously habitat destruction, invasive species, fire and climate damage. All right, so the world came together, agreed, we're going to solve this problem. We signed up to 23 targets, 4 goals. Bada bing, bada boom, multilateralism solves all of our problems. We can just walk away and job's done, right? That's how it works. That's how it feels at the moment. I think there was a lot of hope and optimism when the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework was signed off. But in reality, we know that's just the start, and it creates some top-down pressure, but there are lots of other things that we as a community, and I'm going to talk about we as this community, as the conservation community a bit, need to do to actually see material shifts on the ground. There's a lot of fanfare and excitement, and I was there. I've been over to COPs, I've been involved in this process. They're really important things to happen, but they are not, they don't occur in isolation, and in and of themselves won't change the world. Lots of excitement, but then lots of questions as well. So I'm going to talk about one really significant issue that biodiversity faces in Australia, and it's a major funding gap. In terms of what we give credit for and what we say we aspire to, and there's a no new extinctions banner right behind me, and we've got lots of global targets and goals. There's lots of science that says that, in recent years around what is needed to save biodiversity from an investment perspective. There's a paper come out this year, and there's a large range there for threatened species. You can see it's between $2.4 to $15.6 billion per annum, depending on which paper you're looking at and which type of analysis you're looking at. If you've got questions on that, I'm pretty sure James was on both of those papers. So later at the Q&A, all questions directed towards him. But I want to focus on the left-hand column for a moment, because we are a wealthy nation. $785 billion, and over the forward estimates, we get very close to $1 trillion federal budget. Out of that, so we do an assessment every year from now on, the Biodiversity Council, where we actually start going through and categorising budget line items. So starting at the federal government, we'll do it for all states and territories eventually, because it's a lot of work. And that's what that QR code will take you to. So don't just take my words for it, and challenge us. If you disagree with these figures, come back to us and say, actually, I think you're missing this, or this should be there. But when we look at what actually is hitting the ground from the federal budget for biodiversity programs, it's about $470 million. When you look at biodiversity, what we consider biodiversity adjacent programs, so that might pick up some of your biosecurity that also has primary industry focus that expands a bit. But overall, 6 cents in every $100 is hitting the ground for conservation out of the federal budget. you want to talk about barriers to action, that's one of the big ones. When we test this with the Australian community, and that's what this is, the Australian community is really supportive of increasing investment in biodiversity. There's never a campaign against, when Minister Plibersek announced the Saving Bushland program, it wasn't a campaign against it, it was welcomed. So there is public support for this. So then where is the barrier? We also have targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework around tackling hard things, biodiversity harmful subsidies. Now, we're often, when we go and make the case to politicians or Treasury or finance or people around increasing investment in biodiversity, we are told that which hospital do we want to defund, which school do we want to close? We're forced into these trade-offs about social goods and things around market failure. The reality is that Australia has actually signed up to a commitment to reforming biodiversity harmful subsidies. We did the first assessment of what those are. It's about $26.3 billion in biodiversity harmful subsidies at the federal level. If we just reformed a section of that, we could deliver a double dividend where we're not subsidising harm and we're reinvesting that in public good. Now, you tell me how much that conversation is happening at the Treasurer's productivity roundtable that's going to happen in August. And if you're in Canberra, or if you pay close attention to the Canberra bubble, that's all that is being talked about at the moment. So what hampers action? Well, you know, there's a whole host of things. I've talked about funding and political will and sitting at the edges of the political agenda, but we've got fragmented and ineffective legal protections, disengaged media, we've got pernicious threats like invasive species. That all that it needs is for us to just sit down our hands and the problem will expand. I'm going to talk about, so this is the negative part, I'm going to talk about the positives in a moment and give you a bit of hope. Lack of public awareness and doing the job of selling this story to Australians, we need to make people understand the scale and extent of this crisis. And we also need to do some really tricky things like work with other sectors to reform the incentives that exist for doing harm. But now I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about where things have worked. Restoration in a contested landscape. So for those who are unfamiliar with the history of feral horses in Kosciuszko National Park and the Australian Alps, it's been one of the most contested debates, and if you're in New South Wales National Parks or even New South Wales Government, you are acutely aware of this. But what's astounding is, for me, is what was once thought impossible was overturned within 18 months to deliver what I would argue is one of the most significant on-ground outcomes in this state in decades. Okay, so we've gone from a landscape, and you can see the transformation just in that one little photo, but we've gone from a landscape that had close to 20,000 feral horses that were pretty much unmanaged to the removal of that pressure. Now, this is a landscape that's a national heritage place. 20 years ago, there was talk about nominating it as a World Heritage Area. It is the only alpine landscape in Australia. It represents a small fraction of our landmass. It is a really important part, and it has species that occur nowhere else in the world. And all of a sudden, we've had this dramatic change. And how did that happen? Before the New South Wales federal election, I had a very senior member of the New South Wales government, very senior minister, say to me, James, New South Wales Labor government is never going to shoot a horse from a helicopter, right? We just shot 15,000 of them. Pretty incredible. And full credit to the Reclaim Kosci campaign, Invasive Species Council, National Parks Association, New South Wales and ACT, because they've done incredible work, and all the people working on this. But I want to talk about what combined and what brought that change about. It involved outspoken advocates. I've just talked about them, making the case for change, not shying away, taking the fight to the media. It involves shifting media narratives, being sophisticated in how we talk about the problem, and maybe Jack Goff from the Invasive Species Council talked about that. It involved deep community support and diverse perspectives. But you can see I've put some hourglass things there as well. And where there's an hourglass thing, those things happened really, really quickly. And The other things took a really long time to build. So you have to work at different paces to get the scale of change we're talking about. The three things I want to talk about are political shifts, adequate funding, and entrepreneurial public sector. In particularly that entrepreneurial public sector. The only way that we got to a point where Labor shifted on that particular position was that there was pressure within the system and outside of the system. And in the absence of that, I don't think we would be in a situation where we've given that landscape a fighting chance. So my plea to this group, to this room, which is why I believe so strongly in the Australian Committee for IUCN and IUCN more broadly, is it brings two very diverse communities, civil society representing, I mean that not just in terms of NGOs, but the broader anyone not in government, and the government sector together. For the civil society sector, sometimes it feels safe to not talk about things. Sometimes you need to be the noisy miner, or gang cockatoo. We need to work really hard to build bridges and alliances. We don't always agree on things, and we need to invest in shared solutions. For my government colleagues, and I started this writing, is what would I say to myself as a young public servant 10 years ago? Well, actually, it's longer, 15 years. Time flies. Anyway, revel in the scrutiny. People stress about FOIs and GIPPers and all these things. If you are getting FOI'd, your work matters. Revel in it. Be grateful for it. It's a pain in the ass, but it means you are doing important stuff. Be an agent for change. I'm not asking you to break the rules. I'm not asking you to breach your code of conduct. I'm asking you to be an advocate within your agency for change. Because sometimes the people who get right to the top, their job is to manage risk for the minister. Seek ideas. You don't have everything, all the answers, and you probably know this. But there is a collection of expertise in this room and in so many other spaces where you can do great things. And increase your risk appetite. You'll be rewarded for your career maybe by managing risk for the minister. But that's not going to save the things that we care about. This group that we got to, and sorry I'm running up against the clock, the one thing we agreed on was business as usual isn't going to cut it. And for both of us, the not-for-profit, the civil society, the government sectors, we need to find places for trust and dialogue. I think this is one of those important places. We need to develop shared understandings for the problem. And most importantly, when that political window opens, we need to be ready to move quickly. Thanks.